There is no doubt that any real deployment of Hadoop will run on a cluster of machines. And while local mode or pseudo-distributed mode of Hadoop are useful to get going with the technology, there will be time in your life when you would have to manage at least a few machines, maybe a couple dozen, maybe a couple hundred. And times like that call for a tool. There's a couple of tools in Hadoop ecosystem. We will look at two of them, Apache Ambari and Apache BigTop, and we will start with Ambari. Ambari is a nice tool that provides a graphical user interface for managing Hadoop clusters, and it happens to be an Apache Software Foundation project, like pretty much everything else in the Hadoop ecosystem. So the way to get going with it is to navigate to the official website, which is ambari.apache.org. Click on the documentation, click on the quick start guide, and then there will be a bunch of instructions explaining to you how to run it in a VM if you want to run it in your own laptop. But I actually will be doing something different. I will be running the Ambari itself and the cluster itself in the public cloud of Amazon. So as you can see, I pre-created a few nice T2 medium machines. These are nice machines, not too big, not too small, to basically play with Ambari and see what cluster it will create for us. The first machine I will actually use to run Ambari itself. So as you can see, there is a public DNS for this machine available right here. And what I need is to install Linux packages that Apache Ambari community is providing. So in order to install those packages, we need to know where to get them from. So that's actually part of the documentation right here. So if we scroll a little bit, you will see this table that lists all the different versions of Ambari and also different versions of Linux. So my machines happen to be CentOS machines, CentOS 6 to be precise, and I would like to play with Ambari version 2.4. So this is the command that I would have to run. So let's actually copy this command, and this is the host on which I will have to run this command. So let's try logging into that host. I'm doing this by using a private SSH key that was given to me by Amazon when I created those machines. I called it Ambari test, and pay attention to this key because we will also be using it when creating an actual cluster. Another thing that you should pay attention to is that I'm logging into the host as CentOS user, because that's just how CentOS 6 is set up on Amazon Cloud. So let's do this. Now, immediately after logging in, I'm basically becoming a super user, and now I can run this nice command. Okay, and the next thing to do is to basically yum install Ambari server. So let's see what that gives us. Actually, Ambari depends on Postgres database to store all of the information because it's a web application, so it needs to have a database. So let's accept this extra dependency. Let's say yes. And as you can see, packages are being downloaded, so it'll probably take a little bit of time. So now there's an Ambari server being downloaded, almost there. Okay, all of the packages are completely installed at this point. So all that is left for us to do is to set up Ambari, and there's a way to configure it, but we will actually use the quickest way, which is Ambari server setup-s. Which kind of gives a lot of nice defaults, so we don't have to care about coming up with values. So let's run this command. And there is a JDK that's being downloaded for us. There will be a database initialization step that is going to kick in just about now. So Ambari is basically trying to configure all the bits and pieces for us. Okay, that configuration is done. So all that's left to do is to start up the server. So we will do it by saying service Ambari server start. And again, it takes a little while for Ambari to check the database consistency and do a few other things. But at the end of this process, we will have a web UI running on port 8080, to which we can actually navigate just using our browser. And let's wait a little bit longer, give it a little bit more time. Okay, so Ambari is up and running. It successfully started. So now it's time for us to go back to our browser and navigate to the Ambari web UI. Okay, now that we installed Ambari, it's time to put it to a good use. We will use it to deploy our cluster on Amazon public cloud. But in order to do that, we first have to log in into the Ambari UI. We do that by going to the host where Ambari got installed, port 8080, and then we would log in as admin. Now, obviously, this is a very insecure password, so the first thing that we're going to do is to change it. So we're clicking on users, admin, then change password, entering admin, the old one, and putting something much more secure in. Okay, all good now. So time to install our cluster. So clicking here will get us to the installation wizard. And the first thing that Ambari is asking is the cluster name. So let's call it Dumbo. Now let's click next. And the screen that we're looking at right now is showing us different stacks. Now, a stack in Ambari terminology is a full distribution, including Apache Hadoop. We're looking at a few of those coming from a commercial distribution vendor called Hortonworks. And we will use one of those, let's say the latest one, just for convenience and simplicity's sake. So there are public repositories provided by Hortonworks. But remember that you can use any other distribution of Hadoop that comes with an Ambari stack definition. So let's click next. Now, Ambari is asking us all of the host names that we would like to make part of the cluster, and then how to get into those hosts using SSH. Now, here Ambari is asking us an SSH private key and the user account. As you can see, my hosts are all created on Amazon. So I have the 3 hosts running on Amazon. One is actually hosting Ambari itself, and the other 2 are just hosts that I would like to build a cluster out of. And the way that I created them gave me an SSH key. Now, this is exactly the same SSH key that I would use to basically log in into the host itself. So I would use that SSH key that Amazon gave me after the -i option. And if I do this, as you can see, I can safely log in into the host on Amazon public cloud. I'm also using a special username because I'm using a CentOS operating system, and on Amazon public cloud, it is set up in such a way that I need to use CentOS and not root. So with these 2 bits of information, let's actually cat the contents of the private key, because that's what Ambari is asking us. So here's the content. We'll basically just cut and paste it, like this. And then we will get back to Ambari. Okay, now we're looking back at the Ambari screen, and the first thing that we need to do, we need to paste that SSH private key that I showed you. So let's paste it here. As you can see, the last line reads "and RSA private key." That's what you should see when you're doing it yourself. And then Ambari is asking us for the host names. So let's go back to the Amazon console. And the host names that we need to give to Ambari are actually the internal host names. That's just the way that Amazon Cloud is set up, and that's what Ambari is expecting from us. So let's give those to Ambari. Here it is. And let's cut and paste another one. Here it is. Now, last thing that we need to do is we need to replace root here with CentOS. Because like I told you, you cannot really log in as root into those hosts. You need to SSH as CentOS, and then you can become root. So let's click on register and confirm. And Ambari will take a little bit of time to basically SSH into those hosts and make sure that everything is right, copy bits and pieces of software onto those hosts to make sure that they're now under the Ambari management. So let's wait a little bit. Okay, so Ambari is done registering the host. It looks like both of them were successfully registered. Now, it gave us a little bit of warning, so let's see what those are. There is a bit of configuration issue on one of the hosts, actually on both of them with Python. There is a service issue that NTPD is not running. Now, if you're deploying a production cluster, or even if you're deploying a cluster that you would like to use seriously, you should probably correct all of those issues. But for now, we will just going to show you how Ambari is operating, so that is fine. So let's close and let's click next. So it is asking us whether it's okay to proceed with warnings. Let's say okay. So next thing that you could see is all of the members of Hadoop ecosystem and Hadoop itself, things like HDFS, let's say there is Yarn. There's also a couple of other things. And Ambari is asking us what would we like to deploy on our cluster. Now, again, because we're deploying just a toy cluster, let's actually deploy just a few services. Let's do HDFS, Yarn, and that's about it. Maybe let's actually also pick Hive, and let's click Next. Now, Ambari is basically telling us that even though we picked some of the services that require Zookeeper, we didn't pick Zookeeper itself. And you can already see how Ambari is useful in keeping track of things that you would otherwise be forgetting. So let's say that we would like to install Zookeeper as well, because it's a required component. Now, Tez is needed. Tez is needed for Hive, so same deal. It's a dependency, so let's agree to it. Pig is needed. Pig is needed for some of the Hive integrations, so let's agree to that as well. Slider is needed for some of the long-running services, so let's agree to that as well. And then, basically, Ambari is telling us that because we didn't pick some of the other services, we will be having limited functionality of the cluster. That is fine. Proceed anyway, same deal. And now Ambari is basically asking us what host would we like to use for masters. Now, again, you should remember that masters are the hosts that are running all of the coordination services. And because we just have 2 hosts in our tiny cluster, that doesn't matter. But here you would make some decisions on what nodes in your cluster would be running which services. So let's click Next. Remember, pretty much all the time, Ambari is giving you pretty reasonable defaults. So clicking Next is usually safe. And again, right now, Ambari is asking us what slaves or worker nodes we would like to assign. But again, because we have just 2 nodes, the defaults that it gave us are reasonable. So let's click Next. And the next screen that we will be seeing is service customization. So if we would like to make any kind of changes to, let's say, how much memory we're giving to name node or any other customization, that would be the screen to do here. Now, anything that's in red, you actually have to fix. Anything that's not in red, you can tweak or not, that's fine. Like I said, Ambari is giving you pretty reasonable default. So let's fix the Hive one. So let's see what it is first. And Ambari is telling us that it's something on the Advanced tab. So let's click here. So there is something in Hive Metastore that we need to fix, and that's a database password. So basically, the Metastore that it will be installing for Hive needs a password. So let's create a strong, nice password. All fine, no problem. So we can scroll to the very, very bottom and click Next. Okay, so we're done configuring everything that we had to configure about this cluster. So Ambari is basically giving us a whole bunch of things to review, what kind of services we're installing, what is the host allocation, pretty useful stuff. But like I said, we'll just trust the defaults and click Deploy. Now the main phase of deployment starts. So Ambari will take a bit of time to go through pulling all of the packages for all of the components, installing them on nodes, configuring them. So now is a nice time to basically get yourself a cup of tea and wait for this installation to continue. So you can monitor it via the progress bars. You can also see what Ambari is doing right here. So for example, right now it's installing data node. But overall, even for a tiny cluster like ours, it'll probably take a couple of minutes. So let's come back when it's done. Well, it seems to be that what we did was worth the wait. Ambari minted a new cluster for us, installed all of these services, and is now showing a whole bunch of helpful statistics. So for example, it's showing us the HDFS disk usage, name node heap, and a whole bunch of interesting other stuff. In fact, if we navigate to one of those services, we can also use these quick links to basically get to the UIs of name node and Yarn's resource manager, just like this, right? So these are UIs of the cluster that is now running in Amazon's cloud. And we can very quickly go to the things that we know and love just from the Ambari's quick links. So for example, here we're looking at the Yarn's resource manager, and it's very, very helpful to actually explore those services a little bit. Now, one last thing that I will show you is Ambari is actually helpfully showing us alerts. So here, for example, it's telling us that the host disk usage is getting kind of high. And again, given how tiny our cluster is, it's normal, but in a production cluster, you would actually be advised to pay attention to any kind of alerts that Ambari will be showing you and then trying to fix them as quickly as possible. So that concludes our quick tour of Ambari. I highly recommend you use this tool and give it a try. Give it a try in the cloud, give it a try on-prem. It's really a nice tool.